Good evening and good day, everyone. Welcome to episode 12 of Ask Abhijit. Today, I'm going to answer your questions about world history. So, world history is a fascinating topic. It is something we should all learn more about because studying world history helps us understand the forces and the factors and the various influences that shape the course of events worldwide. And these are the events that eventually end up affecting our day-to-day lives. So world history is a fascinating topic. I promise you it's very interesting. It's more interesting than most fiction stories. So these are the things that we're going to discuss today. And as always, you guys have asked a lot of wonderful, very interesting questions. So I have selected a few of these questions that you people have asked, and I'm gonna take those up today. And as always, today is a 60-minute session. And at the end, if there is time, I'm gonna take a few live chat questions. So let us go right in. Let's dive in, and let's take the first question. So this is by Akash. Akash asks, was the battle between Sparta and Athens true, or is it part of their mythology? Good question. So it is a true. It is not. It's not a battle. It was a war, and it is a true war. It's a true event. It's something that happened in the 5th century BCE. So when we discuss history, it's always useful to take a look at the map. So let me show you. Share the map with you. This is where we are. So let me take you to where these events happened. We are here in India. Let's go westwards. So this here is the nation, the modern nation of Greece. So this battle, this war took place in the 5th century BCE between Athens, which you see right here in the middle of the screen, and the city of Sparta, which is here. So these were two coalitions between. So at the time, Greece was divided into nation states, and all of these nation states were at some time or the other, usually invariably at war with each other. They were always battling for supremacy. So Sparta was the traditional hegemonic power in Greece. It is in this peninsula, which is called the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and this war was called the Peloponnesian War. So what happened was that Sparta was the traditional power in Greece. It was the hegemonic power. And in the first half of the 5th century BCE, Athens began to emerge as a powerful city-state. At the time, there was a conflict between Greece and Persia. So much of what is east of Greece, present-day Anatolia, etc., was all occupied by the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the Hashemonish dynasty. And Persia was for a great deal of time at war with the Greeks. So the Athenians, they managed to repulse Persian invasions, and they defeated the Persians in several battles, and they became very powerful, and they had a greater population. So they created a confederation of city-states, an alliance of city-states, and this basically stood against the alliance of the Spartans. So the Spartans had a number of allies on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Now, Athens had a greater population than Sparta. It was more powerful. It was able to build a much greater army, many more infantry soldiers than the Spartans. They grew a big navy, more than 300 naval ships, while Sparta did not have a single ship at all. And the Athenians became so powerful that they basically started extracting tribute from their so-called alliance members, the other city-states. So they became a hegemonic dominant power. And they posed a great threat to the Spartan alliance. So the historian Thucydides, who was from Athens, he observed that the emergence of Athens as a new power threatened to displace the existing hegemony of Sparta. And he said that when such a thing happens, war is inevitable. And this is called the Thucydides Trap. It is something that is relevant even today in geopolitics. Whenever war is essentially inevitable, according to this principle, when an emerging power threatens to displace an existing great power, either on a regional level or at the international level, as the existing hegemon. So this is currently This is currently used to analyze the US-China rivalry. So that's about Thucydides. So the Athenians and the Spartans basically went to war. The war happened in the second half of the 5th century BCE. It was a great drawn out affair. It went on for almost 3 decades, and there were many ups and downs, many phases of the war. There were many détentes. There were many ceasefires as well. There were periods of relative stability, and then they went back to war. Initially, Athens was very powerful. They had a much greater army. They had these hoplite soldiers. Hoplites were infantrymen who were very well armored, and they would have these spears. They had hoplites. They had archers. They developed the archery tactics. They hired swords. They hired horsemen from Scythia. So they built up a great cavalry army as well, and then they used all that on their ships. So they had brilliant naval tactics. They used to put archers and hoplites and even cavalrymen on ships, and they used this to raid the Peloponnese peninsula. And initially the Athenians had a great deal of success, but eventually the Spartans were able to prevail when they started adopting the same tactics that the Athenians had. So at the end of the day, at the end of the war, the Spartans triumphed, and they also had some help from the Persians, from the Achaemenid Empire. So at the end of the day, at the end of the war, they were able to invade and occupy Athens, and that was the end of the war. So that brought an end to the era of Athenian dominance in Greece. It brought the Athenian Empire essentially crashing down for some time. In the next century, there was a brief resurgence of Athens. There was another war, and so on. The history of cycles go on. So that is in brief about the Peloponnesian conflict between the Greeks and the Spartans. It is very much a real conflict, and it is something that historians even today draw lessons from, especially the Thucydides Trap, which says that when a new power emerges and threatens the hegemony of the existing power, whoever it is, then war is almost inevitable. And that's why people believe that today war is more or less inevitable in some form or the other between the Americans and the Chinese. So that's in brief about this question. It's a wonderful question. Okay, Udit asks, can you tell us anything about the life of Napoleon Bonaparte that fascinates you the most? So Napoleon is a fascinating personality. His entire life is fascinating. It's a very adventurous, action-filled life, and he rose out of obscurity and achieved so much. So let me tell you just some highlights from his life. So once again, let's go to the map, because maps help a lot. So we were in Greece. Let's go further westwards. So this is Greece. Now we are in Italy, as you can see, and to the west of Italy, there is this island called Corsica. So this island was historically owned by the Genoans. Can you see the city here, Genoa? So this city was a very wealthy city-state in ancient Italy, in the Middle Ages, etc. And they owned this little island called Corsica. It's not a little island; it's a reasonably well-sized island, and it is on this island that Napoleon was born. So he was born in the town of Ajaccio, or whatever it's called, whatever the pronunciation is. So that's where he was born. He was born in the year 1769. And what's interesting is that at the time it was Italian territory. And when the Genoese sold the island to France, Napoleon's father fought the French. He fought the French occupiers. So Napoleon was born Napoleone di Buonaparte. It's an Italian name, Napoleone di Buonaparte. That was his real name. So his father fought the French on this island, and eventually the rebellion failed, and he made his peace with the French, his father, Napoleon's father, and he was appointed as the emissary of the Corsican people to the Emperor of France. So he went to Paris and he developed good connections with the French. And it is these connections that enabled Napoleon, the young Napoleon, to go to Paris and go to France and enroll in a military school. So he enrolled in a military school, and he had a lot of problems because he spoke the Corsican language. He did not speak French. He learned French quickly, but he had this thick rural Corsican accent for which he was mercilessly teased, but it made no effect on him. He was very very strong-willed, and it was soon found that he was very good at mathematics and logic and tactics, especially at geometry. So his tutors advised him to join the navy, because geometry is a skill that is very useful in naval affairs, especially in naval combat, etc. So Napoleon considered joining the Royal Navy, the British Navy, because he did not feel any particular allegiance to France. But then he decided to join the French army, the infantry, the artillery division, because even in artillery, you need a great deal of geometrical expertise in geometry, projectile motion, distances, and all that. So he joined the French army. He was in the artillery division. And that's when, in 1789, the French Revolution happened, which was a terrible, bloody affair. So he went back to Corsica for some time, for a few years, while the revolution played itself out in France. And then he returned to France. He rejoined the army, or he rejoined his regiment, etc. And then he had a very interesting initiation combat. So there is the city of Toulon over here in southern France, on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. So this city was at the time, so France had undergone this revolution. The monarchy was overthrown. A revolutionary government was in power. And this city, Toulon, was held by royalist forces, and it was helped by the British Royal Navy. So the British Royal Navy was over here in the harbor of this city. They were protecting the royalists with their firepower. And this was threatening to become a big rebellion that would basically undo the changes that the French Revolution brought about. So what Napoleon did was, he, as a young officer, let me show the actual map. So as a young officer, what he did was, he brought his artillery regiment to this city of Toulon. Okay, and there is a hill which overlooks the city. This hill here, it's called Mont Faron. So he had his troops climb this hill with the artillery. He was injured in the attempt to take the hill, but he was able to take the hill. And from here, he was able to threaten the Royal Navy, and he was able to evict them from the harbor of the city. And because of that, the French were able to retake the city, and the revolution was saved. And this catapulted Napoleon to a great deal of fame, and it advanced him in his career, and so on. And then he was appointed as there was a lot more developments. He even foiled an insurrection in Paris. He opened fire with artillery in the heart of Paris, on the insurrectionists. He basically killed 1,400 plus people with artillery firepower. And he again saved the revolutionary government, because of which he was given a big advancement. He was given the charge of the army of Italy. So he went into Italy. He fought many battles there against the Austrians, because when the revolution happened, France lost a lot of territory outside France, which the monarchy had held. Revolutions are dangerous, and these affairs they cause sometimes more harm than good to a nation. So France had lost a lot of territory in Italy. He went to Italy. He regained all the territory from the Austrians, and that again embellished and burnished his credentials. After that, he basically went to Egypt. He wanted to cut off the British trade routes to India. So he entered into an alliance with Tipu Sultan, the butcher of Mysore, and he invaded Egypt with the hope of conquering this country and cutting off the British trade routes to India. So he initially met great success, but eventually the British Navy under Admiral Nelson was able to destroy the French fleet. And so it was an inconclusive affair. So Napoleon went into the regions of Syria, Damascus, etc. And from there, he went back to France. In France, he engineered a coup in Paris, right? He engineered a coup over there. And he essentially became the dictator of France in a very short period of time. He wrote a new constitution, and he proclaimed himself consul for life in France. And he installed himself in the royal palace in Paris. And then what happened was that many other things happened. I'm just going very, very quickly through history. In 1802, so during the French Revolution, slavery had been abolished in the French Empire. But in 1802, Napoleon re-established slavery in the French West Indies, especially Haiti, this place here. And there was a Haitian rebellion which actually succeeded, and it drove the French out of Haiti. So Napoleon found that, and at that time, the French had a great deal of territory in the present day United States. So Napoleon found that this was too much of a distraction, so he sold this territory to the Americans, to the United States, which was at the time only limited to the east of the country. This was called the Louisiana Purchase. An enormous amount of territory was sold to the Americans for about $15 million. And then so that's what he did in the Americas. uh, in 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase. In 1804 he was proclaimed the Emperor of France. He was given the crown by the Pope himself. And in 1805 he became the Emperor of Italy as well. So he achieved so much in such a short period of time. I will not go into the entire history of Napoleon. There's a lot more to cover. But as you can see, he's a fascinating character. And he's one of the most interesting characters in all of world history. So that's a little bit about Napoleon. Very interesting character. I would recommend you study about you read up about his life and his history and his career. He was an adventurer. He had a guerrilla mindset. He had a mercenary mindset, and he basically came out of nowhere and became the Emperor of France. Fascinating story. And he was very ambitious. At the end, he tried to overreach himself, and it cost him. At the end, it cost him everything. But what a life he lived! What a life! So very interesting chapter of history. Very interesting. Okay, is it? How true are the stories regarding gladiators in Rome? Did they really get freedom after winning tournaments, or were they just slaves? So, gladiators were slaves. They had no rights. They were essentially property. So, we look upon Rome as a great empire, a great civilization, a great powerful force in ancient history. And what we tend to disregard because of the way we are taught history is how uh, oppressive Rome was. It was a slave owning oligarchy, which means it was a very small number of people, a very small group of people who held all the power in Rome. And a significant population, significant percentage of the population of not just Rome and Italy, but of the entire Roman Empire was slaves. So slaves were property. They had no rights, right? They could be killed or used in any manner whatsoever. And slavery began in Rome with the mythical founder of Rome, Romulus, who decreed that fathers could sell their children into slavery in order to get rid of debts, etc. So slavery was an integral part of Roman life, of Roman culture. And the other interesting thing about Rome is the gender disparity they had. So the gender ratio was 7 to 5 men to women. There were 7 men to 5 women because of the practice of female infanticide, which was routine and widespread. Female children were looked upon very poorly. No one wanted a female child. It was a burden. So there was this widespread, rampant practice of female infanticide in Rome, because of which the gender ratio was 7:5 men to women. It's incredible, right? And coming back to slavery. So slavery was rampant. People would be taken slaves by the thousands. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, which is present-day France, he decreed people to be slaves instantaneously the moment he captured a town or village. 50,000 people at one time immediately became slaves, and they were sold off, and Julius Caesar got richer and richer by engaging in this slave trade. So not only did he plunder the resources of the Gaulish territories, the Celtic territories of Iberia, of other regions of Germania and whatnot, not only did he plunder these territories for all their resources, for gold and metals and other valuables, but he also set everybody to slavery. And these slaves were all carted off to Rome, and they were sold off in slave auctions, and they were put to different uses. And some of them ended up as gladiators. Becoming a gladiator was also a punishment in Rome. So a citizen who was guilty of certain specific crimes could be punished to go and fight in the arena. as a gladiator. So gladiators were property, they were slaves. Very, very few of them, if any, would ever get their freedom. You could not just win your freedom by winning a couple of tournaments. You were still owned by a slave owner, by a gladiator school, by a stable. They were called stables, like stables for horses. So they had stables of gladiators. And the typical lifespan was very short for gladiators. They had a very, very intense training regimen, and many of them would die in their first fight in the arena. And I think the median age at death was 27 or thereabouts. There are many cemeteries that have been found of gladiators. So these people usually have elongated right arms. The bones of the right arm are usually elongated. Most of them were right-handed, and they would practice, they would train with the sword from day to night, because of which this deformity would occur. And left-handed gladiators were advertised as a rarity because there were very few. And so where does the name gladiator come from? It comes from the name of the Roman sword, which is called the gladius. So the Roman straight sword was called the gladius, and that gave rise to the name gladiators, the ones who used the gladius to fight. So the gladiators went through intense training regimens. They had short lives. They ate predominantly a vegetarian diet, right? Which is surprising, but it has been found to be true because they have analyzed the bones of gladiators from gladiator cemeteries, and they have found through chemical isotope analysis that the diet was predominantly vegetarian, and with a great deal of barley and other grains. And there was some meat, but it was mostly vegetarian. So once again, these were slaves, these were property. It's a very interesting period of history. There was even a gladiator revolution, the third servile war, I think. So there were three servile wars in Rome. These were slave insurrections, slaves who tried to rise up against the tyranny and the oppression of Roman society. So these were three separate wars in the second and the first centuries BCE. One of these was the great gladiatorial rebellion led by a gladiator called Spartacus. He was a Scythian from Thrace. Thrace is further east from Rome. It's essentially western, the westernmost part of Turkey and north of that. So that was not Turkish at the time, that region. It was a Scythian. The people were mostly of Scythian extraction. Scythians are an ancient Indo-Iranian people. So that's a different story altogether. So a gladiator named Spartacus, who was of Thracian origin, he led this great insurrection against the Romans, this great rebellions. It actually threatened Rome itself at one point. And eventually this rebellion was crushed by the Romans. And there was this great road to Rome. I don't remember, I forgot the name of the road. It was lined up with crucifixes, and these gladiators were all crucified for miles and miles as a warning to other slaves. So Rome was a brutal society. A significant percentage of the population was slaves, and only a small percentage of the population were actually given the title of citizens. These were the nobility, the aristocracy, the landowners, and the prosperous people. Everybody else was either plebeians, not plebeians, they were basically the commoners, non-citizens, or even worse, slaves. So that's in brief about Roman society. Very interesting question, sir. Akash has asked a lot of good questions, so I've taken a bunch of those today. So the question is, what was the prime factor behind the British ruling most of the world at one time? And how did they become so strong and greedy? So as always, when an event happens in history, there is a lot of context and there's a causal chain behind it. And that causal chain can go back centuries. So let's go back to the root of how this all began. So in the 14th and 15th centuries, the English were a middling small kingdom in Europe. It was not a powerful kingdom at all. The British were a small middling kingdom. And in the beginning of the 15th century, you had this not great, but very famous king, Henry VIII. So Henry VIII was a king of the Tudor dynasty. He was well known for marrying many, many wives and executing most of them eventually. And he had this He had delusions of grandeur. He saw himself as one of the great statesmen and conquerors of the world. And he also was had this tendency to fall in love very often. So he was initially married to Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess. He had a child with her, a daughter named Mary, and he wanted a son naturally. And Catherine, for whatever reason, was unable to bear a male child for him. And so Henry VIII fell in love with a noble woman named Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. Now, in those days, I mean, you would imagine a king who could just marry whoever he wanted, but no. In Europe, the supreme power rested with Rome, the Catholic Church, the Vatican. And the Pope was the supreme authority in the whole of Europe, who decided what kings could and could not do. So Henry VIII had to request the Pope to grant him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and allow him to marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope refused. So that's the power the Pope had. That's the power the Vatican had. They were actually the supreme power in Europe. They had more power than any king, any emperor in Europe. So the Pope refused to grant Henry the annulment of his marriage. So what Henry did was he refuted the authority of the Vatican Church. He embraced Protestantism, and he created a new church in England, the supreme authority of all Christians in England, the Anglican Church. So he broke off from the Vatican. He changed his faith. Basically, he made the whole of England Protestant. He started his own church, the Anglican Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the supreme head of this church, and he had the marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and he married Anne Boleyn. So this essentially ended the hegemony of the Catholic Church in England. Now, it had long-term effects on England. The Catholic Church had imposed the so-called Dark Ages on Europe. No new ideas were allowed. No science was allowed. Science and anything which was not written in the canonical texts of the church, anything that was not in this text was basically termed as Satanism, and it was punishable by death. So this is the hegemony that ended in England. And after Henry died, his daughter Mary tried to revoke what Henry did. She tried to bring Catholicism back, but she died in a very short period of time. And her sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she is the one who restored her father's reforms. Yeah, and she made England a strong Anglican country, a Protestant country, and her age is called the Elizabethan age. It is the age when new ideas came into England. It's the age when new money started coming into England from India, right? So this is the time when great changes started to happen in England. So new ideas were afforded. People were no longer discouraged from thinking differently. Science was allowed. Mathematics was allowed. Indian sciences and mathematics made their way into England. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton would use these to proclaim that he has discovered calculus. And then because of that, you had new ideas and new technologies coming into England. And all of this together, the new money, the immense amount of money that started coming in from India, the new ideas, the new technologies, new sciences, basically brought about the Industrial Revolution in 17th century England. And you had brilliant minds like Newton and Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke and the other scientists who brought about a revolution in the sciences. And this is what impelled England into becoming a global power. The new technology, the navigation, the focus on the navy, and the sciences that allowed the navy to go very, very much further than any other navy had gone before. All of this is what made England into this global power. So it all started with the break that Henry VIII effected with the Vatican Church. Now, how did England become so strong and greedy? I explained how they became so strong. How did they become greedy? Well, they were always greedy. England was always a feudal society, a terrible caste, not caste, but class system. They accuse India of casteism. Good God, have you seen the feudal nature of English society? There was a time in England around 1,000 years ago when more than 10% of the population was slaves. They had to wear this copper or brass rings around their necks. And England has always been a land of a great divide. You have the small aristocracy and nobility, which essentially held all the lands and held all the power, and they decided what would happen, and they decided the fates of the peasants, the people, the poor people. So England was always a greedy nation. They exploited their own people relentlessly, mercilessly for centuries. They were always greedy for expansion. And once they were empowered with the unlimited wealth from India and all this technology and science, then they just expanded outwards. And that's how it all happened. That's how the British Empire was born. So that's a great question. Again by Akash, a related question. The Americans are descendants of the British and yet they fought against them for independence. Please explain. So these people have no allegiance to anybody. The conquest of America was all for money. It was for greed. This nation, the United States, was built on the genocide of one people, the Native Americans. At least 100 million must have died. And it was also built on the slavery of another people, the African origin people, the black people. So it was a land of immense profits, immense territories just to be stolen away from the natives, and use the blacks to do any labor you want, give them 1 or 2 meals a day, and you're done. So it was a land of immense profits for these British who went there. And soon they became very rich and very powerful. But the problem was that they owed their allegiance to the British crown. They had to send back all the profits, much of the profits to the British crown in the form of enormously heavy taxes. And they resented that very much. They said, we are so many thousands of miles away from England. Why should the crown of England have any sway over us? And that's why they fought for independence. It was the independence. They fought for the independence of a small group of white men and their families. The independence did not apply to the Native Americans or to the black slaves. And the voting rights, all the franchise was with the white men only, right? So that's the war for independence. It is portrayed as this great heroic struggle for justice and equality and freedom. That's absolute nonsense. Land of the free, home of the brave. That's how America is portrayed. You should see the Declaration of Independence, in which the kind of language that is used for the Native Americans, it is still there, right? The Declaration of Independence. So it was a very unequal, brutal, racist endeavor. And that was the independence they fought for. It was independence to make unlimited profits and pay no taxes to the crown of England. So that is the reason they fought. They fought to start a new empire in the northern part, in the northern half of the Americas. That's what it was. And eventually, the best minds, the most adventurous people, the piratical minded people, etc., they all made their way from England into the Americas. So essentially, over time, as the British Empire declined, the American Empire correspondingly rose. So America is in a way the reincarnation or the continuation of the British Empire. It's the same culture, the same people, and the same mindset, the same worldview, and the same methodology. So America is essentially a continuation of the British Empire. The empire died in that small island, but it continued in the form of the American Empire, which was the major hegemonic power of the 20th century. It still is to some extent, but it's declining. So that, I hope, answers your question. Okay, Santoshini asks, please tell us about the war between the Emperor Rimush of Mesopotamia and the Indus Saraswati civilization, as was mentioned in the inscription. Right. So this King Rimush of Mesopotamia, he was the second king of the Akkadian Empire. He was in power in the 22nd or 23rd century BCE, about 4,300 or so years before today. So as always, let's go to the map. Okay, first let me show you what this gentleman looked like. So this is believed to be a representation of Rimush, the second emperor of the Akkadian Empire. It's a strangely familiar face somehow, isn't it? Okay, map. So here's the map. We were in Europe. Let's come back eastwards. So this is present-day Turkey, Anatolia, and this is where Rimush reigned. Okay, this is better. So you can see Kuwait here. You can see Basra, if you can see my mouse pointer. So this empire, the Akkadian Empire, was in power from this region near the Persian Gulf all the way into Syria, and it also encompassed parts of Anatolia. So it was this region over here, which you can see in my mouse via my mouse pointer. So that was the Akkadian Empire, and this king Rimush was the neighbor of another empire, a Proto-Persian empire, which was called Ilam. So Ilam was to the east of the Akkadians. It was essentially southwestern Iran. So the region of the Persian Gulf over here, if you can see my mouse pointer, that is Ilam. There was a Proto-Persian empire, a kingdom, and to the east of Ilam you had Marhasi, which was another Proto-Persian region. And Ilam and Marhasi both were strongly influenced by ancient India, by the Harappan phase of India's civilization. So you can see, if you look at the archaeological artifacts, carvings, statues, etc., these are very, very reminiscent of what you find in the Sapta Sindhu region during the Harappan or Indus Valley or Saraswati civilization era of India, of Indian civilization. So Ilam and Marhasi were both strongly influenced by India, by the Saraswati civilization. So this guy Rimush, he was in power for about 8 or 9 years only. He was the son of the great king Sargon of Akkad. So Rimush fought a war first with the Elamites and then with the people of Marhasi. So it is said that when he fought the kingdom of Marhasi, the Marhasi were helped by troops from Meluha. So Meluha is the ancient name that these Sumerians, Akkadians, etc. gave to the Indus Valley or Saraswati Valley civilization. So basically, Indians went and fought on behalf of the Marhasi kingdom against this king Rimush of Akkad. And Rimush, in his inscriptions, he says that he won this war and he defeated the people of Marhasi and their Indian allies. So that is what he has recorded. That is the claim he has made. Maybe he's right. That's what historians believe. So that is the war that he waged not against India, but against this eastern Iranian kingdom called Marhasi. And the Marhasi people were helped by Indian allies. And even the Elamites had a great deal of Indian influence. So that again ties in with what we know of Persia, that it is a descendant of India. The Persian people are the descendants of the Parshva clan of the Rigvedic people. So we can see these influences right here, because Indians went and helped the Marhasi people, who were basically de facto Persians. So that's an interesting aspect of ancient history. Rimush, this king, was in power for 8 or 9 years only. He was assassinated, and then his brother took over. His brother had a much longer and more successful reign as the king of the Akkadian Empire. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, Sovik asks, can you please tell us the difference between modern day Turkey and the Turkic invaders? Are they the same or different ethnic groups? So essentially the question you're asking is, what is the difference between the Turks of Turkey and the Turkic peoples of history? So the Turkic peoples of ancient history are the ancestors of the modern day Turks. Now, if you look at the Turkic peoples who live in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, etc., Uyghurstan, and all the regions of Central Asia, even southern Siberia, etc., you will find that these people have strongly Mongol-like facial features. They are closest. Their closest ethnic relatives are the Mongols, so they have that typical Mongol-style appearance, right? What is traditionally called the Mongoloid appearance. Uh, so that's what the Turkic peoples of Central Asia look like. If you look at the people of Turkey, they look like Europeans. They don't look like Central Asians at all. And nevertheless, it is the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, the ancient Turkic peoples, who are the ancestors of the modern day Turks. So the ancient Turkic peoples were the distant cousins of the Mongols. Both these ethnic groups descend from the Hunnic peoples, who are attested to live in present day eastern Xinjiang around 2,500 years ago. There were many Hunnic invasions into India as well, and we also assimilated some of these Hunnic peoples. So the Turks and the Mongols are distantly related, and the Turks, they basically lived in Central Asia. Now, in the 13th century, in the late 12th and early 13th century, when Chinggis Khan suddenly expanded all across the world, the Turks ran for their lives, and they went east, they went westwards and southwards, and they entered Anatolia, and that's the region they conquered, and they eventually established the Ottoman Empire. So there was this Turkic leader called Suleiman Shah, who was the first Turk to enter Anatolia. So these are the original Turks. The Turks of today, the people of Turkey, are their descendants. And these ancient Turkic peoples are the ones who invaded India as well. The various Turkic invasions, the Mamluks, who were Turkic slaves, who formed the Delhi Sultanate, and the Turks who invaded the first one, this new dynasty, which was initiated by Babur. He was also a Turk. They are now called the Mughals because the British called them the Mughals, but they were actually Turks. So the Mughal dynasty is actually a Turkic dynasty. So those are also related to those people who invaded Anatolia and founded the nation, the Ottoman Empire, which is now the nation of Turkey. So that is the relationship between these various Turkic peoples. There are lots of different Turkic groups across Central Asia. Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, not Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. Let me look at the map. I have it here. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, parts of western present day China, which is Xinjiang, which is East Turkestan, and also the Siberian peoples of southern Siberia, etc. So these are all Turkic peoples. They all speak a variety of Turkic languages, which are to some extent mutually intelligible or not. So these are the Turkic peoples. They're spread across a wide region of Eurasia. And the modern day Turks are descendants of ancient Turkic peoples. I hope that clarifies this matter. Good question. Akash, again, before the First World War, which war cost the most lives? So that's a good question. That's something we should know about. So, uh, before the First World War, there were many, many, many wars that had a great death toll. For example, before the First World War, you had colonialism, which extracted an immense death toll across various parts of the world, across Africa, across Asia, even the Americas. So, for example, in the 1885s, from 1885 to 1908, approximately thereabouts, you had the Belgian Free State, which was essentially owned by King Leopold of Belgium. It was the Congo Free State. It was in Central Africa. And it was a period of incredible exploitation of the native people. They were put to work as slaves. Children, men, women, elderly, everyone. Children were mutilated. Their arms and legs were cut off and whatnot. At least 10 million Africans, at the very conservative estimate, died during the Belgian occupation of the Congo. That was a horrible period. And then there was this scramble for Africa in the 19th century, when the whole of Europe scrambled for Africa, to divide up Africa into small pieces and extract as much as they could out of it in order to enrich themselves. So Germany conducted a genocide in Namibia. Other countries did all kinds of atrocities everywhere else. The French were involved, the British were involved, Netherlands, the Germans, and so many other, Belgium, like I said. So at the very least, 50 million Africans would have died in the 19th century in this colonial occupation of Africa. Then you had the European colonization of North America only in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, which cost at least 100 million lives of the Native Americans. You had the British colonial occupation of India, which cost minimum 100 million lives in relentless year after year engineered famines. One year you would have 2 million deaths, one year 5 million, another year 1 million. Every year you had millions of people dying in these artificially engineered famines. So you had at least 100 million Indians who died in that. And in the 1857 War of Independence, at least 13 million people died in that. So that is some of the figures. And then let's look at China. China has seen enormous conflicts. Like I said in another episode in the past, China is used to war, but all those wars are internal wars. They are all civil wars. China's great military feats are all military feats against its own people. So you had the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century from 1850 to 1860s on thereabouts, in which from between 50 and 100 million people died. In just a decade and a half, approximately 100 million people died in China in this Taiping Rebellion. And then you had the transition from the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty in the 17th century, in which at least 25 million Chinese died. So that's another civil war. You had the An Lushan rebellion in the 8th century, in which 30 to 40 million Chinese died. You had the Donggan revolt again in the 19th century in Western China, present-day China, in which 10 to 15 million people died, mostly Chinese Muslims. And then outside of China, you had the conquests of Timur, in which 70 to 20 million people died. And then you had the Turkic invasions and occupation of India, which is not documented at all because India is a secular country, but I would say that at least 500 million people died over 5 centuries in India. 500 million Indians minimum during these Turkic invasions and occupation of India. So that is the kind of death toll the world has seen. It's it kind of makes you question humanity. There is this theory, the violent ape theory or something like that, which says that humans and apes are the same. We have the same aggressive instincts that are inbuilt in our DNA, and we just can't help it. We just have to keep fighting each other. So the same aggressive tendencies are seen among chimpanzees. They also form groups and coalitions and go to war against each other. Their warfare is brutal, and we are no different. We share about 90 to 95% of the same DNA with the chimps, or at least more than 98%. So we are very similar to our closest evolutionary cousins, and we have the same urges and instincts and aggressive drive. So all these numbers, they tell you they kind of bring that out, So that's the kind of history the humanity has seen, and I've only touched some parts of recent history. There have been many more wars and many more deaths and all that. So that, I hope, briefly and roughly answers your question. Okay, this is a question by Mr. Arya. How is the Inca civilization of South America related to Indic? Spanish archaeologists provide Christian-centric data to indigenous Peruvians. No serious effort deciphering in Inca language. Should Indian archaeologists play a vital role? Sun worship is prevalent in polytheistic faiths, though the Inca civilization is medieval. So this is a question that many of you have asked. I have taken this particular question. Many of you have asked about the relationship between India and the ancient Americas, if there is any such relationship. It's a very, very interesting question. Good question. So the Americas, the southern part and the northern part, 2 continents, have had very ancient civilizations. The Incas are a medieval civilization. They were, let me show you the map again. Okay, 1 second. Let me bring the map back. Here it is. Let me remove the question. Okay, let's go to the Americas. So the Inca civilization was in southwestern, in the northwest of South America. So it included parts of Colombia. It included Ecuador, Peru, parts of Bolivia, parts of Chile, and parts of northern Argentina. It was a very large civilization, a large empire. It is a pre-Columbian empire. It was destroyed by the Spanish when they colonized South America. So these people, they were basically, like you said, polytheistic. They worshipped a variety of gods. The sun god is one pattern that occurs throughout all the civilizations of the Americas. The sun is always worshipped as a god, and so is the moon, so are other elements of nature. So there are male gods, female gods, and it's a polytheistic culture. And other civilizations such as the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, the Chimu, the Moche, the Olmecs, etc., all of them show a similar pattern. They all were polytheistic in nature. They all worshipped a sun god. They also had other gods like the plumed serpent, Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl, and many other gods. And like you said, like somebody else at least has said, there is a great deal of similarity between the people of India and the people of Mexico, etc. They look very similar and all that. So yeah, this is all called circumstantial evidence. There is a great deal of circumstantial evidence that kind of makes one wonder, is there a connection between ancient India and these ancient peoples of the Americas? And I've only spoken of the South Americas. There's a great deal of history in North America as well. They also had great cultures and civilizations which have been totally ignored by historians and archaeologists. So the question is there a relationship between ancient India and these ancient peoples? And the answer is there could be, but as of now, there is no confirmation of that. We don't have sufficient data. There was this book by an Indian author called Bhikshu Chamanlal, who brought to light lots of similarities in culture, traditions, possibly even language to some extent, between these ancient cultures and these peoples who still live there and ancient India. So there is a possibility, but we don't have evidence. We don't have sufficient data to say either yes or no. Can Indian archaeologists play a role? I would say that Indian archaeologists should first start playing a role in India. They are doing nothing in India. The whole of India is unexplored from the archaeological perspective. So we need to first explore our own history before we can go and help others, right? Explore India itself, gain some experience, gain some knowledge, gain a great deal of expertise in using the different tools of archaeology, especially the new scientific tools and methods. Make archaeology scientific, make it a scientific pursuit, do it extensively in India, and then maybe you can go and help other cultures and countries. So in the future, maybe India can do that, but first India needs to sort out its own internal unsolved historical matters. So I hope that answers your question, sir. Okay, this is another question that I have got many times. Why did Hitler use the swastika symbol? So the symbol that we are referring to as the swastika is an ancient symbol that is found throughout Eurasia. In other episodes, I have spoken about the fact that before the Christianization of Europe, the entirety of Eurasia, stretching from India in the east to Ireland in the west, was a single cultural continuum. You had the same culture essentially spread across this vast region, and you had lots of different local manifestations of this culture with different traditions and different names, but they were all manifestations of the same underlying overall ancient culture. And therefore, you find the swastika everywhere in Europe, everywhere in every ancient culture of Europe, among the Celtic people, among the Gaulish people, among the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the people of Santorini Island, the people of various other volcanic islands in the Mediterranean, even among the Nordic people, the so-called Vikings, the Scandinavians, the Germanic peoples, everybody used the swastika as a symbol of divinity, as a symbol of auspiciousness. It was an auspicious, very positive symbol. And they all had different names for the swastika. So the English called it the Gamadian, I think. The French called it la Croix Gammée. The Germans called it the Hakenkreuz, and so on. So the symbol that Hitler used was the Hakenkreuz. He called it the Hakenkreuz. The Nazis called it the Hakenkreuz. It is only after the defeat of the Third Reich and the death of Hitler when people rewrote history, and then they inserted the Sanskrit name swastika in there. So they have tried to malign the auspicious sacred swastika by associating it with the symbol that Hitler used. Yes, Hitler was an Aryan supremacist. He believed that the Europeans were the original Aryans, right? He wanted this pan-Aryanist movement. He claimed supremacy, racial supremacy for the Aryan peoples. And he tried to associate this Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross, with the Aryan race. He needed a potent, powerful symbol for his political movement. So he took this Hakenkreuz, he twisted it further and turned it into a symbol of evil. But that was the Hakenkreuz. It was not the Indian Hindu dharmic swastika. It is later that historians inserted the name swastika instead of the Hakenkreuz. So that is one of the ways in which historians have been maligning India and Hinduism. So Hitler did whatever he did. He was an evil man. He was a monster. And they have tried to associate our sacred auspicious symbol, which is used across Asia as a symbol of auspiciousness. They have tried to associate the symbol with that monster, that evil monster. And that is something that we need to push back against. I mean, even today, you will see that in Japan, they will depict the temples by swastikas. Let's go to Google Maps again. I'll show you right away. So we are in the Americas. Let's go to Japan. This is Japan. Let's go to an ancient city. Let's say Osaka. Let's go into Osaka and let's look for temple. I'm going to search for temple. Just temple. And can you see this? You have the Buddhist swastika, the reverse swastika, which is used to depict temples across Japan. So that is how auspicious this symbol is in Japan, across the dharmic world, across the Buddhist world, the Eastern Asian world. And that is the symbol these people have tried to malign by associating it with that genocidal monster. So this is something we need to fight back against. We need to reclaim the swastika as an auspicious symbol, as a symbol of good, not of evil. And I think in the future, I will do a session about this ancient symbol. It's a very interesting topic. So this is a great question. Okay, one more question by Akash. If communism and Marxism failed at every step and is responsible for killings of millions of people, why is it popular even today? It's because it is so easy to fool people, especially when the fooling is done from a position of authority. When your professors are trying to fool you, you will get fooled by them because they represent authority and knowledge. And you believe that they are trying to help you out, right? They are trying to educate you and help you. And that's how they propagate all this nonsense. Let me explain in one sentence what communism/Marxism is. Marxism is a socio-political toolkit that enables a very small number of people to capture and retain political power. That is what Marxism is. And the vast majority of Marxism practitioners are the cannon fodder. So the people who go and demonstrate on the streets, the people who fight guerrilla wars, the students in schools and universities who go on and do these protests, etc., and vandalize property, they are the cannon fodder. Behind them is a small group of masterminds who actually understand what Marxism really is. That it's a means of capturing and retaining political power, capturing it by any means necessary. And Marxism always talks about equality, about the good of the people, about the equality of the masses, about the upliftment of the oppressed, downtrodden proletariat, and the evils of the evil bourgeoisie, etc. And it is this pseudo-intellectual language that sounds like they have got everything figured out. And that's why people are so drawn towards Marxism, especially people who feel that they have been oppressed in some way, or they have been treated unfairly. And that is something that it's a sentiment you can evoke in almost anybody, anywhere in the world. You are seeing the deep polarization that you are seeing in the United States. It is a consequence of the Marxist education that they are getting over there. So in brief, that is why Marxism is so successful even today, because they have the power of propaganda. They have killed more than 100 million people, whether it is Mao Zedong or Pol Pot or Stalin or the Angolan experiment with Marxism, etc. It's exacted a horrifying death toll, and yet it continues to be so popular because it is used as an instrument of acquiring political power. It's a very powerful instrument. I will go into this in a separate session, perhaps, or maybe I'll do a separate video about this, what exactly Marxism is. But this is a very good question. So, with that, I have come to the end of the questions I have selected. Let me take a couple of live questions if there are. I can see there are lots and lots of them. I have answered some of these questions. Okay, Mrunal asks, one second, let me remove that question. Yes, Mrunal asks, is the earth flat or oval? Thank you, Mrunal, thank you. Is the earth flat or oval? It's not a complete, perfect sphere. It is a distorted sphere. And if you look at the shape of the oceans on the earth, it's an oval. And this oval shape is because of the tides. It's because of the gravitational effect that the moon exerts on the earth. So this tidal effect causes the oceans to bulge in two directions. The sun also exerts some gravity on the earth, and this interplay of the gravitational effects of the sun and the moon causes the shape of the oceans. If you see from far away, it bulges out into an oval shape. But the hard geography of the planet is more or less spherical. It's slightly extended at the equator, so it's like a squashed sphere. So it's not perfectly spherical. It's an interesting phenomenon, especially the tides are an interesting phenomenon. So I hope that answers your question in brief. I want to talk about history. Yes, in world history. Let me take some world history questions. There's a super chat. So Timur was a Turkic king. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan. We have no evidence of that. And the Mughals, Babur claimed to be the descendant of Timur and of Genghis Khan too. There is a claim. When you want to aspire to greatness, you make claims. I am descended from so and so or so and so. So there is no evidence that he was actually descended from either Timur or Genghis Khan. And there is no evidence that Timur was himself descended from Genghis Khan, even though he made the claim. So the Mughals are Turks. Babur claimed descent from Timur, but that's a hypothetical thing. We don't really know. We have no evidence of that. Why was Samarkand the precious place to conquer? Samarkand is in a dreary, hot place. It's in the Fergana Valley, if I'm not mistaken. There was something especially precious about the place. It became rich because of the conquest from India. So lots of gold and jewelry and precious stones and slaves from India were taken there to Samarkand and Bukhara and Tashkent, and these places became rich as a consequence of the conquests of India, of the various invasions of India. So that is your answer in brief, sir. Okay, what would have happened? This is by Milan. What would have happened if Nazi Germany had won the war? How much would the war have helped India to gain independence? If the Germans had won the war, we would be having this conversation in German. And would that have helped India to gain independence? Well, they would have smashed the British, so India would have gained independence from the British. But would the Germans have continued expanding across the world, and would they have again subjected India to occupation? We don't know. It's a hypothetical scenario. So things would have been certainly very different had the Nazis prevailed in the Second World War. Aditya asks, how did humans, native people of America or Australia, reach the far distant lands of America and Canada from Africa or Europe when there were not many ways of reaching through sea? They reached by sea. They reached these lands, faraway lands, on canoes, on boats or rafts or outrigger canoes. I mean, there was this Scandinavian explorer called Thor Heyerdahl who actually built a canoe based on ancient designs. It was called the Kon-Tiki, and he undertook a voyage that either crossed the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. I don't remember right now, but he crossed one of these two oceans, and he demonstrated that it was possible to survive such an arduous sea voyage on basically just a raft, a primitive raft, and he was able to cross over. So it is possible to do that if you understand navigation and if you have some element of luck and if you prepare properly with all the provisions and water for this long voyage. So I think it is believed that it is most likely that ancient humans crossed over in that manner. I think ancient Indians crossed over. Ancient Indians during the Harappan times had a great deal of expertise in navigation. So I don't think it was very hard for them to reach Australia. But the other peoples who reached the Americas in ancient times, it would have been a much harder challenge for them to do that. So I think they did that on various kinds of primitive or quasi-primitive floating crafts, either canoes, outrigger canoes, or extended drafts. And that's how I think it happened. It is now known that there has been human inhabitation at least in South America for more than 100,000 years. More evidence is emerging. So the history of the Americas and of the world is changing. We are soon going to see new facts, and history may be rewritten all over again. So that's an interesting topic. This is by Ritu Patil. Thank you, Ritu. Some people believe that the Anglo-Saxon invasion, much like the AIT, is made up and there is promising evidence to it. Anglo-Saxon invasion of which place? We know that there was a Saxon invasion of the British Isles, which happened about 15 or 1700 years before today. The Saxons and the Angles, these are two Germanic tribal groups or ethnic groups. They invaded the British Islands. They conquered much of this territory. They subdued the local Celtic peoples, and they established this Anglo-Saxon rule and culture in the British Islands. And later the Normans invaded in the year 1066 under William the Conqueror, Duke William of Normandy. And then they imposed French Viking composite culture on the Anglo-Saxons. So this is what we know. It is all, we have evidence for it. If you are referring to of England, okay, I get it, of England. So yes, we have substantial evidence for the Anglo-Saxon invasions of the British Islands. There is definitely a lot of evidence for it. We know it happened, and the later Norman invasion also is very well attested. So yes, it is credible, and there is evidence for this. The Apollo landing, I don't see it. I don't think it is fake. No. Okay, anything else? I'll take one more question and then we will be done. Okay, this is about the pyramids of Egypt by Vaibhav. This is the last question for today, people. So why pyramids like Egypt were not made in ancient India? Well, there is a very good reason for it. Building a pyramid of that size is an extremely expensive endeavor, and a great deal of labor, manpower, money, gold, treasure, and time has to be expended on building a pyramidal monument which serves no purpose to the people or the nation. It simply serves to glorify the emperor. Now, India's emperors were not like that. They had to follow a code of conduct, a code of ethics. They basically served dharma, and they served the people and the kingdom or the nation or the civilization, depending on whether it was a small king, a big king, or an emperor of the whole of India. So they served the people, they served the nation, the civilization, and they served dharma. And according to dharma, you cannot have this sort of wasteful expenditure. You have to prioritize the long-term prosperity and security of the people and the kingdom. And building a pyramid like the Egyptian pyramids does not serve that cause in any way whatsoever. It actually detracts from that cause. You're wasting a lot of money and time and all that in building a monument to glorify yourself. Indian kings never glorified themselves. That's why we don't have any great palaces in India. Kings, even emperors lived humbly. And you will see that all the time. Even recent kings and emperors. A great king like Shivaji, the great Chhatrapati Shivaji, did he have a palace? He had fortresses because he had to fight back the Mughals, the Turks. So fortresses were not palaces; those were military strongholds. But he himself did not live in a palatial palace or anything. He lived humbly. Queen Ahalya Bai Holkar, she lived very humbly. Every Indian king or queen lived humbly. They did not have opulent show off palaces and all that. Even in the Harappan or Sapta Sindhu region phase of India's civilization, the biggest buildings you will find are public buildings, meeting places, or public baths and all that. There is no evidence of a single palace in the entirety of the geography of the Sapta Sindhu region in the Saraswati and Indus valleys and the other valleys of the region. So Indian kings and queens and emperors have never ever wasted money in this manner. Their only focus, their only duty has been to further the national interest and to serve the people and the civilization. And their highest morality was the long-term peace and prosperity of the people and the kingdom. So that's the reason why pyramids like Egypt were never made in ancient India. All right, people, we have come to the end of today's session. Great session, great questions. And this is the first of many sessions that we will do about world history. So that's it for today. And I look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's episode. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good night. Have a good day. And I'll see you. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.